The morning sun cast long shadows across Kandahar airfield as Captain Zara Ghost Vostok walked toward the briefing room, her Barrett M82 slung across her shoulder like a familiar companion. The 50 caliber rifle drew stares and whispered comments from the gathered Marines, their voices carrying the kind of casual dismissal reserved for outsiders who didn't belong. She was an anomaly here, a woman in her 30s with silver threading through black hair, carrying sniper equipment that most men struggled to handle, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The mystery began 3 days earlier when satellite imagery had captured something impossible. Deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains, reconnaissance drones had photographed what appeared to be a Soviet-era Mi-24 Hind helicopter, a gunship that hadn't been operational in Afghanistan for over 2 decades. The aircraft bore no markings, no identification, yet intelligence suggested it was being used to coordinate Taliban supply routes through mountain passes thought impassable. More disturbing still, the helicopter had vanished from subsequent surveillance passes, leaving only questions and the growing certainty that something extraordinary was happening in those ancient peaks. Colonel Marcus Kane stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face betraying none of the skepticism he'd voiced privately about bringing in an Air Force pilot for what was clearly a ground operation. The assembled team represented the best of Marine Force reconnaissance, hardened men who had survived multiple deployments, each carrying the weight of countless missions in their steady gazes. They looked at Vostok with polite professionalism that barely concealed their doubt. "Gentlemen," Kane began, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in uniform, "meet Captain Vostok. She'll be providing overwatch and tactical support for Operation Shadowhunt." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Vostok could feel the temperature in the room shift. She'd heard this before, the careful introduction that said everything and nothing, the implicit suggestion that she was here as a favor to higher command rather than as an essential asset. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his scarred hands folded across his chest. His eyes held the kind of measured assessment that came from years of evaluating who would watch your back when the bullets started flying. Beside him, Corporal Jake Bulldog Patterson couldn't quite hide his smirk, the expression of a man who had seen too many support personnel fail when the pressure mounted. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken judgments, the kind of institutional skepticism that had followed Vostok through most of her career. But there was something else in her bearing, something that made the more experienced operators pause in their initial assessments. The way she held herself spoke of battles fought and won, of decisions made in split seconds that had determined who lived and who died. The morning briefing would reveal the scope of their mission, but the real test would come in the mountains, where the thin air and unforgiving terrain would strip away pretense and reveal what each member of the team was truly made of. Captain Vostok set her rifle against the wall with practiced ease, the weapon's presence a silent declaration that she intended to be more than just another name on the mission roster. The helicopter in the mountains wasn't just a tactical problem. It was an impossibility that demanded answers, and answers in this part of the world always came with a price measured in blood and sacrifice. As Kane began outlining their insertion plan, Vostok studied the faces around her, reading the subtle signs that would tell her who would trust her judgment when everything went wrong, because in her experience, everything always went wrong. The mission parameters were deceptively simple: locate and neutralize the aircraft, identify its operators, and gather intelligence on the supply network it was supporting. But simplicity in briefing rooms had a way of becoming complexity in combat zones, where every decision carried consequences that rippled through lives and families thousands of miles away. Vostok had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments often came not from enemy action, but from the assumptions and prejudices of the people fighting beside you. Colonel Kane's laser pointer traced red lines across the topographical map, projected on the wall, each route representing hours of careful planning, by intelligence analysts who had never felt the bite of mountain air or the weight of a rifle at 30,000 feet. Primary insertion will be via CH-47 at Landing Zone Falcon, approximately 15 kilometers from the target area, he explained, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of a man who had delivered countless such briefings. From there, it's a foot patrol through terrain that hasn't seen American forces since 2003. The helicopter's rotor wash would announce their arrival to anyone within miles, but stealth insertions in this terrain were a luxury they couldn't afford. The mountains here rose like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in clouds that could hide entire armies or conceal nothing more than shadows and wishful thinking. Satellite imagery could show you where to land, but it couldn't tell you what was waiting in the valleys between the ridgelines. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand, his question carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "Sir, what's our extraction protocol if the primary LZ is compromised?" It was the kind of question that separated veterans from newcomers, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always planning for the moment when the best-laid plans collided with enemy intentions. Kane nodded approvingly. Secondary extraction points have been established at grid coordinates that will be distributed during final mission prep. Captain Vostok will have direct communication with aviation assets and can coordinate close air support if needed. The words were meant to reassure, but Vostok caught the subtle emphasis on "if needed," the unspoken assumption that a pilot, even one trained in ground operations, might not fully grasp the complexities of coordinating air support in mountainous terrain. She remained silent, her expression giving nothing away as Kane continued the briefing. There would be time later to demonstrate her capabilities, and she had learned that premature explanations of her qualifications often raised more questions than they answered. Better to let her actions speak when the stakes were real and the margins for error had vanished. The mysterious helicopter represented more than just a tactical challenge. It was a ghost from conflicts past, a reminder that in Afghanistan, the dead sometimes refused to stay buried. Soviet equipment had a way of surfacing decades after its supposed destruction, maintained by mechanical knowledge passed down through generations of fighters who had learned to make the impossible functional. If someone had managed to restore a Hind to operational status, they possessed both technical sophistication and organizational capabilities that demanded respect. Corporal Patterson studied the mission timeline with the intensity of a man calculating odds, his eyes moving between the insertion point and the target coordinates with practiced efficiency. The numbers told a story of distances that would test endurance, timing that left little margin for delay, and contingencies that assumed everything would go according to plan. In his experience, plans were useful until the first shot was fired, after which survival depended on training, instinct, and the quality of the people fighting beside you. The briefing room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh illumination casting sharp shadows across faces marked by years of service in places where comfort was a luxury few could afford. Each man present carried the invisible weight of previous missions, of decisions that had saved lives or cost them, of moments when split-second timing had determined whether families would receive folded flags or welcome home embraces. Captain Vostok understood this weight intimately. Her service record, classified at levels that required special clearance to access, told the story of a pilot who had flown missions that officially never happened, in aircraft that didn't exist, supporting operations that would never appear in any public accounting of American military actions. The Barrett rifle she carried wasn't just equipment. It was a tool she had used to reach across impossible distances and solve problems that couldn't be addressed through conventional means. The mountain helicopter wasn't just an intelligence anomaly, it was personal. 3 months earlier, during a classified operation in the same region, her squadron had lost 2 aircraft to what intelligence had dismissed as lucky shots from obsolete surface-to-air missiles. But Vostok had seen the precision of those attacks, had felt the electromagnetic signature of targeting systems that shouldn't have existed in Taliban hands. The hind represented answers to questions that had kept her awake during the long flights back to base. Questions about capabilities and coordination that suggested their enemies possessed resources and technical knowledge far beyond what intelligence assessments indicated. As Kane concluded the formal briefing, the room filled with the familiar sounds of preparation, the soft rustle of maps being folded, the metallic click of equipment being checked, the low murmur of conversations as team members began the mental transition from planning to execution. These were the sounds Vostok knew better than any melody, the music of professionals preparing to risk everything for objectives that most of the world would never know existed. The weight of expectation settled across the room like mountain fog, obscuring individual doubts while highlighting the collective responsibility each person bore for the others. In 12 hours, they would board helicopters that would carry them into terrain where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats, and the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to split-second decisions made by people operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. Rodriguez approached Vostok as the formal briefing ended, his manner carrying the careful respect of a professional evaluating a new team member. "Captain, I've read your file, at least the parts they let me see. Impressive flying record." His words carried no condescension, only the acknowledgement of one experienced operator recognizing another. "What I'm curious about is how someone with your background ended up carrying ground-pounder equipment." The question held no malice, only the practical concern of a man who needed to understand the capabilities of everyone who might hold his life in their hands. Vostok had answered similar questions throughout her career, always walking the line between operational security and the need to establish credibility with people who would be counting on her judgment when the mission went sideways. "Flying teaches you to see the big picture, Sergeant," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned hard lessons about the relationship between air and ground operations. "But sometimes the most important targets are too small for missiles and too important to miss." She gestured toward the Barrett with a slight nod, the movement economical and precise. "This extends my reach when flying isn't an option." The answer satisfied Rodriguez's immediate concerns, while raising others he was professional enough not to voice in front of the team. He had worked with enough specialized operators to recognize someone whose capabilities extended far beyond their official job description. The Barrett wasn't standard equipment for Air Force pilots, and the casual familiarity with which she handled the weapon suggested training that went well beyond basic marksmanship requirements. Patterson remained skeptical, his expression carrying the wariness of someone who had seen too many mission plans collapse under the weight of unrealistic assumptions about individual capabilities. "No disrespect, Captain, but mountain warfare is different from anything you've trained for. The altitude alone will knock most people flat, and we're talking about terrain where a twisted ankle can get the whole team killed." His concern was valid, rooted in experiences that had taught him the brutal honesty of high-altitude operations, where physical conditioning and mental toughness were tested against environmental factors that showed no mercy for good intentions or impressive service records. The mountains of Afghanistan had broken better men than any of them, and overconfidence in this environment was often indistinguishable from suicide. Vostok nodded acknowledgement of his concerns, recognizing the professionalism behind the challenge. "You're right about the mountains, Corporal. They don't care about rank or service branch." She paused, her gaze moving across the faces of the men who would be trusting their lives to her judgment. "But they also don't care about assumptions. The mission requires someone who can put accurate fire on target at extended range in conditions where conventional air support might not be available. That's why I'm here." The statement carried no arrogance, only the matter-of-fact assessment of capabilities that would be tested against reality in less than 12 hours. Each member of the team brought specialized skills that complemented the others, and survival would depend on how effectively those skills could be integrated under the pressure of combat operations in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Kane observed the exchange with the satisfaction of a commander watching his team work through the natural process of establishing trust and understanding capabilities. He had seen enough operations succeed or fail based on how well team members could adapt to working with unfamiliar personnel under extreme stress. The questions being asked now were better than the doubts that might surface when lives hung in the balance. The mysterious helicopter in the mountains represented more than just a tactical objective. It was a symbol of the unpredictable nature of asymmetric warfare, where enemies adapted and evolved while conventional forces struggled to keep pace with innovations that emerged from desperation and necessity. If the Taliban had managed to restore Soviet-era aircraft to operational status, it suggested organizational capabilities and technical knowledge that fundamentally altered the tactical equation in the region. As the team dispersed to begin individual preparations, Vostok remained behind, studying the topographical maps with the intensity of someone memorizing terrain that might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The mountain passes shown in satellite imagery told only part of the story. The real challenges would come from factors that couldn't be photographed or measured: wind patterns that changed with altitude, weather systems that could appear without warning, and enemy capabilities that intelligence assessments might have underestimated. The Barrett rifle leaning against the wall represented more than just firepower. It was a symbol of the precision and patience required for operations where second chances were rarely available. Every shot would need to count. Every decision would carry consequences that rippled through the mission and potentially beyond. In her hands, the weapon became an extension of skills honed through years of training that had prepared her for moments exactly like this. 12 hours until insertion. 12 hours to finalize equipment checks, review contingency plans, and make peace with the possibility that not everyone who boarded the helicopters would be coming back. It was a calculation that every military professional learned to make, the mental arithmetic of acceptable risk balanced against mission requirements, and the larger strategic objectives that gave meaning to individual sacrifice. The mountain helicopter waited in its hidden valley, a mechanical ghost from conflicts past that had somehow found new purpose in an ancient war that showed no signs of ending. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions that had haunted intelligence analysts and operational planners for months, but those answers would come at a price that couldn't be calculated in briefing rooms or measured by satellite imagery. Captain Zara Ghost. Vostok picked up her rifle and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty briefing room like a countdown to revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about their enemy's capabilities and intentions. The pre-dawn darkness at Kandahar airfield carried the weight of impending action, that electric tension that settled over military installations when operations moved from planning to execution. Vostok completed her final equipment check in the armory, each piece of gear inspected with the methodical precision of someone whose survival depended on mechanical reliability under extreme conditions. The Barrett scope had been zeroed at the range the previous evening, its optics calibrated for the altitude and atmospheric conditions they would encounter in the mountains. Her personal equipment told the story of someone who had learned hard lessons about the importance of redundancy and preparation. Backup communication devices, extra batteries, medical supplies that went beyond standard field kits, and ammunition carefully selected for the specific challenges of high-altitude shooting, where air density and wind patterns could affect bullet trajectory in ways that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. The team assembled in the ready room at 400 hours, their movements carrying the quiet efficiency of professionals transitioning into combat mode. Rodriguez checked communications equipment with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that radio failure in the mountains meant isolation that could prove fatal. Patterson reviewed his demolitions kit, each component accounted for, and secured against the vibration and impact of helicopter insertion. Kane appeared precisely on schedule, his presence commanding attention without requiring announcement. "Gentlemen, Captain Vostok, final weather update shows clear conditions for insertion, with mountain winds within acceptable parameters. Intelligence confirms no change in target status. The aircraft remains in the valley, though we've detected increased electronic activity in the area." The electronic signature data suggested their target wasn't just hiding, it was actively communicating, coordinating activities that intelligence analysts were still working to decipher. The implications were troubling. If the helicopter was serving as a command and control node, neutralizing it might trigger responses from assets that hadn't yet been identified or located. "Sir," Rodriguez interjected, his voice carrying the concern of someone whose job was to anticipate complications, "do we have any updated intelligence on personnel numbers or defensive positions around the target?" It was the question every ground soldier learned to ask, the difference between walking into a manageable engagement and stumbling into a prepared ambush. Kane's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to signal that the intelligence picture remained incomplete. Thermal imaging suggests minimal personnel in the immediate target area, but the terrain provides numerous concealment opportunities. That's why we're going in light and fast, with emphasis on reconnaissance and target confirmation before any direct action. The words carried reassurance and warning in equal measure. Light and fast meant mobility and stealth, but it also meant limited support options if the situation deteriorated beyond their ability to handle it independently. They would be operating at the extreme edge of their support envelope, where help measured its arrival time in hours rather than minutes. Vostok understood the tactical mathematics better than most. Her pilot training had taught her to think in terms of fuel consumption, ammunition loads, and the physics of aircraft performance at altitude. Every pound of equipment carried was a trade-off against mobility. Every minute spent in one location increased their vulnerability to detection and counterattack. The Barrett rifle she carried represented maximum capability at minimum weight, but it also committed her to a specific role in the team's tactical formation. The flight to the insertion point would take them over terrain that had witnessed decades of conflict, valleys where armies had marched and died, peaks that had watched empires rise and fall while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The Hindu Kush mountains held secrets that dated back millennia, and the Soviet helicopter was just the latest mystery to be hidden among their ancient ridges and forgotten valleys. As they moved toward the flight line, Vostok caught fragments of conversation between team members, the casual banter that served to release tension while maintaining focus on the mission ahead. These were men who had learned to balance professionalism with humanity, understanding that survival often depended as much on psychological preparation as physical readiness. The CH-47 Chinook waited on the tarmac like a mechanical predator, its twin rotors still as it prepared for the flight that would carry them into terrain where modern technology would be tested against ancient landscapes and determined enemies. The helicopter's crew chief completed his pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness of someone whose attention to detail might determine whether everyone who boarded would be coming back. Patterson approached Vostok as they prepared to board, his expression carrying a mixture of respect and residual skepticism. "Captain, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about extending your reach. In country like we're heading into, sometimes the most important targets are the ones you never see coming. How do you plan to handle close-quarters situations if we get jumped?" The question revealed tactical thinking that went beyond the obvious challenges of their mission. Mountain warfare was notorious for the way it could compress engagement distances, turning long-range precision weapons into liability when survival depended on immediate, close-quarters response capabilities. Vostok appreciated both the question and the tactical awareness it demonstrated. She opened her equipment bag to reveal a compact carbine configured for close-quarters battle, its accessories and modifications speaking to someone who understood the need for versatility in unpredictable tactical situations. The Barrett handles problems I can see coming, Corporal. This takes care of the surprises. The weapon represented the kind of careful preparation that separated professionals from amateurs, the recognition that tactical situations rarely conformed to the neat categories established in training environments. Rodriguez nodded approval, recognizing the hallmarks of someone who had learned to think beyond the limitations of single-purpose equipment. "Good to see someone who plans for Murphy's Law," he observed, referencing the military axiom that anything that could go wrong would go wrong, usually at the worst possible moment. The comment carried acceptance, the acknowledgement that Vostok had demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that earned respect among experienced operators. It was a small victory in the ongoing process of establishing credibility with people whose trust might prove essential when the mission moved beyond planning into the chaos of actual combat. As they boarded the Chinook, Vostok took her assigned position and began the mental transition from preparation to execution, that psychological shift that every combat veteran learned to make when crossing the threshold from safety into danger. The helicopter's engines spooled up with increasing intensity, their mechanical voice drowning out conversation, and marking the beginning of a journey that would carry them into terrain where their skills and preparation would be tested against reality. The mystery of the mountain helicopter waited in its hidden valley, a puzzle that would soon demand answers paid for in risk and potentially in blood. As the Chinook lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying them toward whatever truths lay concealed among the ancient peaks, each team member settled into the familiar rhythm of operations where success and failure were often separated by margins too small to measure and too important to ignore. The flight to the insertion point carried them over landscape that transitioned from the relatively civilized chaos of Kandahar to the raw, unforgiving beauty of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Through the helicopter's small windows, Vostok watched the terrain change from agricultural areas dotted with compounds and irrigation systems to barren ridgelines where human presence was measured in centuries rather than generations. Each mile took them farther from support and deeper into territory, where survival would depend entirely on their preparation, skills, and ability to work together under extreme stress. The Chinook's crew chief, a veteran sergeant whose name tape read Morrison, moved through the cargo bay with practiced efficiency, checking safety systems and communications equipment while monitoring weather conditions that could change rapidly in mountainous terrain. His presence provided reassurance. These were the professionals whose expertise in navigation and aircraft systems would be responsible for getting them to their destination and hopefully bringing them home. Rodriguez studied topographical maps one final time, memorizing terrain features that might prove crucial if navigation equipment failed, or if tactical situations required movement to areas not covered in their original planning. The maps showed elevation contours and major geographical features, but they couldn't convey the brutal reality of terrain where a wrong turn could lead to impassable cliffs or valleys that became death traps if enemy forces controlled the high ground. 15 minutes to LZ Falcon, Morrison announced over the internal communications system, his voice cutting through the helicopter's mechanical noise. The announcement triggered final equipment checks as each team member verified that weapons were properly secured, communications equipment was functional, and personal gear was configured for immediate movement upon landing. Vostok performed her own final checks with the systematic thoroughness that had become second nature through years of operations where mechanical failure or human error could cascade into catastrophic consequences. The Barrett rifle was secured in its traveling configuration, but ready for rapid deployment, its scope protected against impact and vibration, while remaining immediately accessible. Her backup carbine was positioned for quick access, if close-quarters situations developed faster than long-range solutions could be implemented. The terrain below had become increasingly forbidding, with ridgelines that rose like ancient battlements and valleys that disappeared into shadows where satellite imagery couldn't penetrate. This was landscape that had defeated armies throughout history, where environmental factors imposed tactical constraints that no amount of technological superiority could completely overcome. The Soviet Union had learned this lesson at enormous cost, and American forces had been receiving their own education in the unforgiving realities of mountain warfare. Patterson checked his demolitions equipment one final time, each component verified and secured against the impact of helicopter insertion, and the stress of movement through terrain where every piece of gear would be tested against gravity, weather, and hostile action. His explosive charges represented both problem-solving capability and insurance against situations where retreat might require creating new routes through obstacles that conventional forces couldn't overcome. The mysterious helicopter that had brought them here represented more than just an intelligence anomaly. It was a symbol of adaptation and persistence, of enemies who refused to accept defeat and instead evolved new methods of resistance using whatever resources they could acquire or develop. If Taliban forces had indeed restored Soviet-era aircraft to operational status, it demonstrated technical sophistication and organizational capability that demanded serious tactical reconsideration. LZ Falcon in sight, Morrison reported, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone who had delivered countless teams into hostile territory. Conditions look good for insertion. Wind from the northwest at 10 knots, visibility unlimited, no obvious ground threats detected. The words provided tactical reassurance while acknowledging the limitations of observation from aircraft moving at operational speeds over terrain that offered countless concealment opportunities. The absence of obvious threats meant little in mountains where entire fighting forces could remain invisible until they chose to reveal themselves through hostile action. Kane moved forward to coordinate with the aircraft commander, their conversation inaudible over the helicopter's noise, but their body language conveying the careful professional interaction of experienced military personnel, managing the transition from transport to tactical operations. Every detail of the insertion had been planned and rehearsed, but mountains had a way of imposing their own requirements that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. As the Chinook began its descent toward landing zone Falcon, Vostok felt the familiar combination of anticipation and focus that preceded every transition from preparation to action. The mystery of the mountain helicopter was about to be confronted directly, and the answers they found would either validate their intelligence assessments or reveal that their enemy possessed capabilities that fundamentally changed the tactical equation in the region. The helicopter touched down with the controlled impact of a machine designed for operations in challenging terrain, its twin rotors maintaining power while the crew chief supervised the rapid offloading of personnel and equipment. Each team member moved with practiced efficiency, understanding that minimizing time on the ground reduced their vulnerability to observation and potential attack. Within 60 seconds, the Chinook was airborne again, leaving them standing in a mountain valley where silence replaced mechanical noise, and the weight of isolation settled across the team like mountain fog. They were now committed to the mission, operating at the extreme edge of their support envelope in terrain where help would be measured in hours rather than minutes, and where survival would depend entirely on their preparation, skills, and ability to work together under whatever conditions they encountered. The silence that followed the Chinook's departure was profound, filled with the kind of absolute quiet that only existed in places where human presence was measured in minutes rather than generations. Vostok adjusted to the acoustic environment, her senses adapting to the subtle sounds that would provide warning of approaching threats or changes in weather conditions that could affect their movement and tactical options. The altitude made itself known immediately. the thin air requiring deeper breathing and more conscious effort for physical exertion. At nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, the atmospheric conditions would affect everything from weapon performance to human endurance, imposing physical constraints that no amount of training could completely overcome. Each team member would need to monitor their own condition, while remaining alert to signs that altitude was affecting their teammates' performance or judgment. Rodriguez established communications with their Tactical Operations Center, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air as he reported successful insertion, and confirmed their readiness to begin movement toward the target area. The radio contact provided psychological reassurance, a lifeline to support elements that could coordinate assistance if the tactical situation deteriorated beyond their ability to handle independently. Falcon Base, this is Falcon 1. Insertion complete, all personnel accounted for, proceeding to phase Line Alpha as planned. Conditions green, no immediate threats detected. The formal language of military communications provided structure and clarity that would be essential if rapid decision-making became necessary under stress. The terrain ahead of them told the story of geological forces that had shaped this landscape over millions of years, creating valleys and ridgelines that channeled both weather patterns and tactical movement in ways that couldn't be fully understood from satellite imagery or topographical maps. Every fold in the ground could conceal observation positions or fighting positions. Every ridge could provide cover for movement or become a killing ground if enemy forces controlled the high ground. Kane studied the terrain through binoculars, his practiced eye identifying routes that balanced speed against concealment, while avoiding areas where tactical disadvantage could prove fatal. The path to their objective would require careful navigation through terrain where a wrong turn could add hours to their movement, or lead them into areas where observation from hostile forces might compromise the entire operation. Movement Formation Alpha, Kane announced quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Rodriguez has point, Patterson follows at 50 meters. Captain Vostok and I will provide overwatch from elevated positions as terrain permits. The tactical formation balanced security against speed, ensuring that the team maintained mutual support while minimizing their vulnerability to the kind of ambush tactics that had proven effective against conventional forces throughout the history of mountain warfare. Vostok checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that the Barrett rifle was ready for immediate use, while her backup weapons remained accessible for close-quarters situations. The tactical balance between long-range precision and immediate response capability would be tested by whatever conditions they encountered, and survival might depend on the speed with which she could transition between different tactical roles as circumstances required. The first kilometers of their movement provided opportunities to assess how effectively the team functioned together in the challenging environment of high-altitude terrain. Each person's pace and rhythm would need to be calibrated against the group's overall endurance and the tactical requirements of maintaining stealth while covering ground at a rate that would allow them to reach their objective within the planned timeline. Rodriguez moved with the confident efficiency of someone whose experience had taught him to read terrain for both opportunities and threats, his route selection balancing speed against concealment, while avoiding areas where tactical disadvantage could prove catastrophic. His point position required constant assessment of factors ranging from weather conditions to potential observation points, making decisions that would affect the entire team's security and mission success. The mountain air carried scents and sounds that spoke of landscape largely untouched by human presence, where the primary threats came from environmental factors rather than hostile action. But the team's intelligence briefings had made clear that this apparent emptiness could be deceptive. Their enemies had proven adept at using terrain for concealment and at remaining invisible until they chose to reveal themselves through action. As they climbed steadily through terrain that tested both equipment and endurance, Vostok found herself thinking about the helicopter that had brought them here. The idea of Soviet-era aircraft restored to operational status represented more than just mechanical achievement. It suggested organizational capability and strategic thinking that intelligence assessments might have underestimated. If their enemies possessed such resources, what other capabilities might they have developed in secret? The mystery waiting in the mountains ahead would soon provide answers to questions that had implications far beyond their immediate tactical situation, answers that might reshape understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions throughout the region. But first, they had to reach their objective while maintaining the security and stealth that would allow them to gather intelligence without triggering responses that could compromise not just their mission, but their survival. 3 hours into their movement, the team had settled into the rhythm of mountain travel, where each step required conscious attention to terrain conditions and weather factors that could change rapidly with altitude and exposure. The physical demands were substantial, but each team member had demonstrated the conditioning and mental toughness required for operations in this environment. They were making good time toward their objective, while maintaining the tactical discipline that would be essential when they encountered whatever was waiting in the valley ahead. The terrain gradually became more challenging as they climbed toward the pass that would provide access to the valley, where satellite imagery had located their target. Rock formations created natural observation points that could conceal friendly or hostile forces, while weather patterns in the mountains showed signs of potential change that could affect visibility and movement conditions. Every factor required constant assessment and adaptation of their tactical plans. Rodriguez called a brief halt near a cluster of boulders that provided concealment from observation, while allowing the team to check equipment and assess their progress toward the objective. The pause provided opportunity for hydration and calorie intake that were essential for maintaining physical performance at altitude, while communications checks ensured that their lifeline to supporting forces remained functional. Falcon Base, Falcon 1. Phase Line Alpha reached on schedule, all personnel in good condition. Weather conditions remained favorable, no enemy activity detected. Proceeding to Phase Line Bravo as planned. The radio traffic provided reassurance to command elements while establishing timeline markers that would trigger search and rescue operations if the team failed to maintain scheduled contact. Kane studied weather patterns building to the west, his experience reading mountain conditions suggesting that their tactical window might be more limited than originally planned. Cloud formations indicated potential for rapid weather changes that could affect both visibility and aircraft operations, factors that might require acceleration of their timeline or modification of their extraction plans. "We may have weather moving in faster than forecast," he observed, sharing his assessment with the team. "Let's pick up the pace while maintaining noise discipline. I want to be in position for target observation before conditions deteriorate." The comment triggered subtle adjustments in movement techniques and equipment configuration, as each team member prepared for potentially more challenging conditions ahead. Weather in the mountains could transition from clear to hazardous within minutes, imposing visibility restrictions and creating dangers ranging from exposure to disorientation that could prove fatal if proper precautions weren't maintained. Vostok adjusted her equipment load to optimize for the increased pace, ensuring that essential items remained immediately accessible while non-critical gear was secured against loss during rapid movement. The Barrett rifle's weight was becoming more noticeable with altitude and exertion, but its importance to mission success meant that finding more efficient carrying methods was preferable to reducing capability. As they resumed movement toward their objective, the mystery of the mountain helicopter seemed to pull them forward through terrain that had witnessed conflicts spanning decades and empires. The answers they sought were drawing closer with each step, but those answers would come with risks that were just beginning to make themselves known through changes in weather patterns and the growing sense that their presence in this ancient landscape had not gone unnoticed. The approach to Phase Line Bravo required navigation through terrain that became increasingly complex, with multiple route options that each carried different advantages and risks. Rock formations provided concealment, but could channel their movement in ways that reduced tactical flexibility, while more open areas offered better observation capabilities at the cost of increased vulnerability to detection by hostile forces. Patterson's demolitions expertise became valuable in unexpected ways, as he identified geological features that could provide emergency concealment or create obstacles if tactical situations required rapid modification of the terrain. His assessment of rock stability and potential for controlled collapse added another dimension to their tactical planning, providing options that might prove essential if they encountered organized resistance. The silence of the mountains was gradually being replaced by subtle sounds that suggested they were approaching areas where human activity, current or recent, had left its mark on the landscape. These were the acoustic signatures that experienced operators learned to recognize: the distant echo of mechanical noise, the pattern of disturbance in wildlife behavior, the subtle changes in air movement that suggested constructed obstacles or defensive positions. Rodriguez held up his hand in the signal for halt, his attention focused on something ahead that hadn't been visible from their previous position. The team immediately adopted overwatch positions, each person selecting terrain that provided both concealment and fields of fire while maintaining visual contact with other team members. In mountainous terrain, the time between detecting a threat and being able to respond to it could be measured in seconds. Movement ahead, approximately 500 meters, Rodriguez reported in the subdued voice that carried clearly without attracting unwanted attention. Intermittent, possibly mechanical in nature. Recommend we establish observation post and assess before proceeding. The report confirmed what intelligence had suggested. Their target area was not as empty as satellite imagery had indicated. The presence of activity, mechanical or otherwise, meant that their approach would require even greater caution, and that their tactical plans might need modification based on what they were able to observe from their current position. Kane moved forward to join Rodriguez in assessing the situation, their combined experience providing redundancy in observation and analysis that could be crucial for making accurate tactical assessments. The decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether they could proceed as planned or whether the mission would require substantial modification. Through her scope, Vostok began systematic observation of the